Hi, my name is Valerie Vandepan, and I am the managing editor of Native News Online. Thank you for joining us for this special edition of Native Bidaské, Native News Online's weekly spotlight on the people making news and leading change in Indian country. Normally, I would not be wearing a mask, but right now I am at University of Kansas teaching wonderful workshops with Native high school students from across the country. So I'm going to be wearing my mask for this episode. Joining us today is Levi Rickert, the publisher and editor of Native News Online, as well as Kristen Lilya and Neely Bardwell. We work with both Kristen and Neely. Kristen is a citizen of Boys Fort Band of Chippewa. She graduated from the College of St. Scholastica with her business management and marketing degree in December of 2020. And now she's a marketing executive for us here at Native News Online and our parent company, Indian Country Media. Neely, who is a direct descendant of the Little Traverse Bay bands of Odawa, began as an intern at Native News Online during the summer of 2021. She is a freelance writer, and she is currently attending Michigan State University and studying social relations and policy with a minor in Indigenous studies. We are so grateful to be working with both of you and that you're taking the time to share with us today on the topic of Indian boarding schools and your generation. I think a lot of times we think of Indian boarding schools as something very much in the past, but speaking with you both, it brings it very much into the present. So I appreciate you all, and I will let Levi take it from here. Thank you.
Yes, and just a correction, it is Odawa tribe she's with, the Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa. That is one of the tribes in Michigan that uses the traditional term. So I just want to make that correction.
Thank you so much, and forgive me. I apologize. I do my best to pronounce everything correctly. And unfortunately, in Michigan, I think a lot of people say it Ottawa. So
they do.
I spent my childhood in Michigan, and that is an old holdover from there. So I apologize.
We understand.
Thank you.
And today's edition is a little different. Obviously, we generally use people who are in the news, and these two young ladies actually work for us. But after last year, with the discovery of the 215 unmarked graves at Kamloops, we have done, since then, Native News Online has done over 100 stories about the Indian boarding school experience. And these two young ladies actually came aboard just a little bit after. Neely came in July, and Kristen came in November. But certainly they had been around us in our newsroom. Not so much Kristen because she works in the marketing, but they are very familiar with the conversations that we've had about Indian boarding schools. And I have to say that as we were discussing it in our newsroom recently, we thought, why don't we do a segment of Native Bidaské that deal with the Gen Z crowd who really, in a sense, they had their eyes, this was new knowledge to some of them. And so we wanted to bring this special edition. I think it's very, very useful. It's like a new generation of Native Americans have discovered this whole discussion of boarding schools. And old timers such as myself, I've known about it for many decades. And certainly during the course of the last year, I've learned a whole lot that I did not know. But so without me just rambling on, let me kind of get into it now. Kristen, and I'm going to ask both of you this question, but Kristen goes first. What did you learn about boarding schools and public schools as you were coming up as a child?
Yeah, I mean, in public school, we didn't touch on it as much as I would like to. Being a Native American student, I kind of had a little background knowledge. We have resources like our Heritage Center, our Heritage Museum that informed me of boarding schools at a really young age. And I had that background knowledge, but in public schools, it really wasn't talked about. And knowing what I know now, I wish we would have talked about it a little more. I know in school it was just kind of a one-day mention of boarding schools, and we really didn't dive deep into what it actually was and what actually happened, which is unfortunate. But I know my tribe and tribes around Minnesota are working really hard to change this curriculum in our public school system, and make Native culture more of a topic to talk about in public school.
Which, thank you for that, Kristen. And Neely, you grew up in the Grand Rapids, Michigan area. You went to a school in the suburb, I guess it's Lowell, right? And I guess it's considered a suburb of Grand Rapids. So tell us about your experience growing up in Lowell, Michigan.
Yeah, so I went to a predominantly white school district. And so I took AP Gov, AP Government, and both AP US History while I was in high school. And neither of those classes talked about boarding schools or boarding school history, and barely talked about Native history at all. I honestly think that the most history we talked about, we spent probably 5 minutes maybe on it, and the history covered it was probably 3 pages out of probably a 500-page textbook. So most of my knowledge of boarding schools at that time was just from my family, my mom. Those are just the conversations that we had. So I, knew boarding schools were a thing, and I knew the history of Native people. But yeah, I did not learn about it at all in high school. It wasn't until I think this year, my sophomore year of college, that I finally learned about boarding schools and actually had a curriculum that talked about Native history, and not only Native history but also Native resilience, which I thought was super special. So yeah, it wasn't until my second year of college that I finally started to learn about boarding school history. So I thought that was very interesting. So yeah.
Well, that's interesting. And what did both of you, once you found out a little more after Kamloops last year, how did you feel? Kristen, what were you feeling once you found out about those realities?
Just hearing more about it, being an adult, it really weighs on your heart. And then it kind of sparked conversations with my family and with other elders in the community, to just ask questions, because I was curious on what they knew, if they went to boarding schools. And it just hearing all of the stories and all of the information that Kamloops made present it just kind of saddened my heart to know that our relatives went through that. And it's about time this comes into light, because it needs to be talked about, and it needs that media coverage.
And Neely, what were you thinking when you first discovered it? And as you mentioned, your mom, you kind of knew about it, but I think all of us, and I actually wrote an editorial, basically title was similar to this, that Kamloops really woke up the world to Indian boarding schools. And of course, we know in Canada they're called residential schools. But what were you feeling last year, right around this time?
Just like Kristen, I was feeling, heartbroken and disheartened by this information. And, this history is not new history to us, but for one of the first times, people that weren't Native that are in my circle that didn't know about boarding schools were seeing these posts on Facebook about these children being found, and seeing my posts on Facebook, and finally having conversations with me about boarding schools. And so I think for one of the first times, people, non-Natives, were finally starting to wake up to this reality that is boarding school history and boarding school trauma. And I honestly think that that discovery kind of started this bigger movement of finally starting to recognize the trauma and the pain that these boarding schools have caused and continue to cause in our communities. So yeah.
So Kristen, what did, in our conversations, you indicated that you learned a lot, maybe from your mom and your grandma, and tell us about some of the family discussions you've had recently.
Yeah, so after Kamloops, like I said, it sparked a lot of conversation, and I went home and I asked my grandma if she knew anything about Indian boarding schools or and she told me, I think this was last year, that she told me that her brothers and sisters, they were quite a few years older than her, but they actually attended boarding schools in South Dakota. They went to Flandreau. But that was a realization to me because I never knew that before. And just knowing that my relatives went to a boarding school was kind of, heavy on the heart. So yeah.
And that was a photo of your grandma on the right and your mother on the left. So
Yeah.
And I understand you're a pretty close family from just.
Oh yeah, we're super close. I chose a college that was closest to my family, so I could just run home if I needed to. So.
And that's the way it's supposed to be with most
Yep.
Anishinaabe and Native families. We're supposed to be close. So yes.
Yep.
And Neely, tell us about your experience. You actually just found something out this year when you went on spring break. Michigan State University student went and saw grandma in Florida, which was wonderful. And tell us what did you discover?
Yeah, so, initially, my mom having conversations with my grandma thought that boarding schools were 2 generations before that. So not my grandma's parents, but my grandma's, grandparents, right? But when I went down there and I started having conversations with her, I brought essays that I wrote for class, and one of my essays I wrote specifically about boarding schools. And I printed it out and I allowed her to read it because she said, bring some of your writing down for me. And so I did. And that essay is what prompted that conversation where she shared with me that her parents actually had gone to boarding schools. And so that was new information, and was very interesting to hear that boarding school trauma and that boarding school experience isn't as disconnected as we thought. And my grandma, she went to a Catholic school as well. So not even though it wasn't a boarding school, a lot of her experiences were similar to that of those in a boarding school. And so it was very interesting to learn. And so it kind of really made boarding school history a little bit more personal, along with, the research I was doing last year about Holy Childhood, which is the boarding school closest to Little Traverse Bay. And that kind of made it a lot more personal. And I remember researching it, and I found a list of all the children that had died there. And I was counting the names, and it was over 100. And I remember breaking down and I started crying because that is something that weighs very heavily to find, to see and to read those things. And that made it very personal because it, is a boarding school that is so close to where my tribe is. So yeah.
Hey, we want to see the picture of your grandmother and your mom. I know you have one somewhere there, right? You're in control of the board. There you go. There you go.
Yeah, so that's my grandma on the right and my mom on the left and me in the middle. This is a picture back from high school. This was our Pink Arrow game football game which honored survivors of cancer. And so I was honoring my grandmother, who is a survivor of cancer.
That's really great. So you actually had an awakening this past spring in Florida. So how did your mom react to that?
So my mom, I think, was a little bit jarred by finding out that information, because, like I said, we were finding out that the trauma of boarding schools wasn't as removed as we thought. And I think that was the biggest kind of realization that was affecting her. So yeah.
Tell us how you're processing this. I guess that's as the editor publisher of Native News, I want to kind of know what this Gen Z's, how are you guys processing it? I was taken back last year when I was in downtown Grand Rapids covering an event. It was soon after the discovery of the graves, and grown women, but in their 20s and early 30s, were crying. And I remember standing there as I was reporting, thinking, wow, this is a new generation discovering what we've known for a long time. And I think that's kind of the point of today's program is I want to know how your generation is processing this.
Yeah. I think, for Gen Z, so my generation, we are the future, right? And so for me, that also means being a cycle breaker, breaking the cycle of trauma that boarding schools and even the, historical events before that have caused, breaking that cycle of historical and intergenerational trauma. And I think now with this release, this release of new information of boarding schools is kind of prompting this new ability to cycle break, and I think a lot of this trauma that kept being perpetuated was because this history and this trauma of boarding schools was not being addressed, and so these survivors and these elders of boarding schools, their trauma that they experienced wasn't being validated because the history wasn't being taught and still isn't. And I think now that the conversations are starting to become a lot more popular, this trauma is finally being recognized that these people face. And so I think now that trauma is finally starting to be talked about, we can start to heal from the abuse and heal from, the trauma, really.
And Kristen, what's your take on it? What are you making of all this? How are you processing it?
Yeah, so it's obviously kind of hard to process, but I look at it as a staircase, and in my eyes, we're on maybe step 2 or 3, especially with this report coming out, and we still have the whole staircase to climb, and I hope with our generation, Gen Z, that we can take a few more steps in the right direction, and yeah, I mean, just like Neely said, we need to continue to educate people about what happened so we don't repeat it in the future. And I think me and Neely are a good advocators for that. And we just hope that the people that need to hear about this, and it never happens again, because it shouldn't have happened in the first place.
Yeah. Let's invite Valerie back on. Valerie, we have some questions for these young ladies. We'll all just stay on screen right now.
Well, I'd like to ask, and I know this is a really sensitive topic that we talked about before we all came on here, because we want to be respectful and we want to make sure we honor where people are at and where they're coming from. And when you talk about family trauma and historical trauma, it's a really sensitive issue. Kristen, when you're talking, you talk so much about your heart and how this is hurting your heart, right? And I think that's a very succinct way of describing that. I'm here at KU. I was just in a boarding school cemetery today. It turns out there's a cemetery of unmarked graves that they sold many, many years ago, and is owned by somebody else now. And those people don't even know that they own a site of unmarked graves. And that all is it's very painful. And when we think about that pain in our heart, how do you heal it? What is the balm that we use to get through and to keep going and to just kind of heal, not just process or sit with it or feel it, but how do we kind of move forward through it? And that might not even be the right question to ask, but I just wanted to kind of throw it out there.
Yeah. So as we all know, healing is different for everybody. For me personally, I think healing is just educating people that don't know, native, non-native. I do a lot of work on my Instagram page, just kind of putting our articles out there so people are aware that it's there. If you know me on Instagram, I'm very vocal about my opinion and things like that. But I think it's just educating to start, and then once people know what happened, then they can start talking about it, you know? And I think just being there for our elders and our family members, just letting them know that you're here to listen. If they want to talk about it, if they're not ready to talk about it, that's okay. Because yeah, like we said, it's heavy on the heart. And what we as Native Americans, what we went through and what we're still going through, it's hard, you know, it's just hard to talk about. And that's why it wasn't talked about for all these years. But I think it's finally time to open those conversations and start talking about it and taking those baby steps into the healing process. And however that healing process looks for you is the right way.
I have a teacher who told me once that when you have a wound, you need to fill it with something that's good. So if you have a heartache, you need to make sure you fill that space of loss or that space of pain with love and with friendship and with family and with support. Because the danger, she would say, is that you turn to alcohol or drugs or some other kind of damaging thing to fill that space. And when I think of filling the heart, I often think of that, and I feel like a lot of folks, when they have that heart pain, it's hard, and we all need to talk about it and to support each other through it, so that space does get filled with something positive instead of turning to something that is not supportive, but can alleviate the pain in a different way.
And I think it's very easy to, focus on, the trauma and the pain of our communities. And I think a lot of times we forget that there's a lot of resilience and there's a lot of strength that our people hold. And I think, we have to, focus more on, the sheer strength of our communities. We're still here. We're still fighting, boarding schools and everything before that didn't break us. And I think it's important to remember that when we talk about boarding schools, because I think when we start focusing on the sheer strength of our communities, that also can help with healing.
Hey, Neely, I have a question. And you were in the newsroom on May 11th when the report was released from the federal government, U.S. Department of the Interior, the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative Investigative Report, Volume 1, as it was called. and Brian Newland, who we know, he the Assistant Secretary of the Interior, he released it, and he basically said that all American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiian families have been negatively impacted by the Indian boarding school experience. You were in the office. What were you thinking? How did you feel that day?
So the release of that report felt very bittersweet to me, right? So these findings in the report were very heavy, very disheartening, and very heartbreaking. You know, to read the number of, cemeteries and the number of children that they've recovered, even though we know that number is a lot larger, reading that was, it's still heartbreaking to read. But also, it was bittersweet because finally we're seeing the federal government on paper in a federal document admit that boarding schools happened and also caused a lot of trauma and a lot of pain and severely damaged our communities. And I think to me that is groundbreaking, and to me that was a step in the right direction. For years the federal government denied their hand in boarding schools. They denied their hand that they played in dismantling our communities. And for one of the first times, we're seeing the federal government admit that what they did was wrong. And I think that is a very validating experience for boarding school survivors and the families of individuals that were in boarding schools, because now they're seeing that what they went through, they're seeing that experience validated and that trauma is validated. And, the effects of that trauma is also being validated. So, yeah.
Kristen, you helped produce 2 live streams that we did that day. We had Shannon McLaughlin, we had Deb Parker, and later that day. And so you actually felt it too. You were not in our newsroom, physically in the newsroom as Neely was, but you certainly felt it that day. What were you thinking that day?
Yeah, I think producing the live stream was a good distraction from what was being said, but still, I almost cried both times that we were live, because what those ladies said was just so informational, and it hit home for, I think, a lot of Native American young people. And yeah, it was very emotional when we went live, and those ladies are amazing and they're very strong Native women, and it was just great to hear them speak about it. And it was a very emotional day, but we were all in it together. And yeah.
And Neely and Kristen, and Valerie should come back in. We just kind of finish this up, have a just general discussion. Given we were talking about the road to healing, and I like to say that healing is a lifelong process. It's not something you can necessarily go to a ceremony, a church meeting, and have instantaneous healing. I think those who have been scarred, it's a lifelong process. So I want to use the word that kind of came to my mind as we were talking in this hour or this segment about responsibility. And I think both of you said this is the generation that can make the difference. What do you feel like your responsibility is? Because I'm going to be real candid. In one of the last conferences I attended, I had a tribal chairman, and he was actually a president of a tribe. He talked about the violence on the reservation, and he is so disturbed by that. And we know that Gen Z kids are out there with all kinds of opportunities as Native youth, but they're on drugs, they're on meth, they are violent, they're part of gangs. And you 2 ladies are not on drugs, you're productive. What would you say to your fellow Native youth, your age, about the responsibility we have to make a difference, this generation?
I would just say we are responsible. We talk about 7 generations all of the time, and this is our generation. So we really need to take the responsibility to be there for our elders and spark conversations and just progress as a community, as Indian country. Our responsibility is just to further the progress, all of the work that Levi's generation has done. We need to just progress.
And I'm old. I'm a boomer. I'm not a Gen Z.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many generations that have done so much work for this. We just need to further that progress. We need to take what they did and take the next steps, like I mentioned earlier.
Neely, you're co-president of your student group there at Michigan State University, the Native American. What's your responsibility? What's your take on that?
As the next generation of Native activists and climate protectors and culture protectors, I think it's our responsibility to not only honor our ancestors, but honor the work that they've done to get us to this point. And I think, me personally, I have the privilege of going to a good school, and I have the privilege of being able to work for Native News Online, and being able to have a voice and give a voice to talk about the things that are important to our communities. I have the privilege to, give a voice to those who, are unable to, promote and talk about the things that need to be talked about. And I think it's my responsibility to recognize that privilege, and not only recognize it, but also use it to, like I said, continue this line of advocacy, continue to fight for our communities and continue to advocate for our communities. And I think, as I'm currently the co-chair for our Native organization at MSU, and our biggest thing there is not only providing a safe space for Native students, but also allowing a space for reconnection for those Native students that didn't grow up, on the reservation, or not even those students, or even those students that didn't grow up in their communities, or grew up disconnected for whatever reason. And one of our main goals is providing that space to reconnect with our culture, because if our generation doesn't take that step in reconnection, then what culture is left? So it's really our job to maintain this culture revitalization, and that's one of the biggest things we're doing at Michigan State, and I'm trying to promote. So yeah.
And thank you for that, both of you. And both of you are great contributors to Native News Online and Tribal Business News. Our Indian Country Media owns both. And thank you for today. And Valerie, why don't you give some closing remarks? And
Well, I'm just so grateful to both of you, both for your work with our organization, but also just your spirit and your heart that you put into everything you do and who you are. Thank you so much, and thank you for sharing not only with us today, but with our audience throughout our platforms. And thank you to everyone who is watching. Thank you for those who joined us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and wherever you're watching this video. We appreciate you, and we share our perspective, and we share all this with you. Thank you. If you like and appreciate our work, please support us. Please follow us on all our social channels, and be sure to make a donation. You can do so via our website, and you can also subscribe to our newsletter there too. And be sure to join us next week for another episode of Native Bidaské. Chimigwich. Ahiye.
Chimigwich, ladies, appreciate it.
Miigwech, Levi and Valerie.